In this lesson, we'll continue the flight we began in the first Autoflight lesson. We left off cruising along at flight level 250. ATC clears you to flight level 310. To make a cruise climb, first set the altitude in the altitude window. Next, push the altitude selector. Pushing the altitude selector changes the FMC cruise altitude to the MCP altitude and initiates the climb. Cruise descents are made in the same way. Pushing the altitude selector changes the FMC cruise altitude to the MCP altitude and initiates the descent. However, if you are within 50 miles of the top of descent with the MCP altitude set below the cruise altitude, pushing the altitude selector initiates a descend now. When a descend now is initiated, the airplane descends at approximately 1,250 feet per minute until intercepting the planned descent path. Approaching the top of descent, ATC clears you to 15,000 feet. Again, for any altitude change, first set the MCP altitude window. Upon reaching the FMC top of descent point, the autothrottle reduces thrust to idle. Idle enunciates on the PFD. After thrust reaches idle, the enunciation changes to hold. Pitch maintains the VNAV path. The angle of descent path is calculated by the FMC to maintain the FMC descent speed profile. Like other Boeing autopilots, the 747 autopilot will not pass through the MCP altitude. If the MCP altitude is reached before the next VNAV altitude, the airplane levels out and the pitch mode engages in VNAV altitude. VNAV remains engaged in what can be considered as a VNAV altitude hold mode. Since remaining level at the MCP altitude affects your ability to recapture the path, let's start a descent. To continue the descent, set the MCP to the next FMC altitude restriction, 10,000 feet, and push the altitude selector. Approaching the next FMC altitude restriction of 10,000 feet, ATC clears us direct to 5,000 feet. You could go to the legs page and delete the 3 altitude restrictions, but a quicker way is to use the altitude selector on the MCP. First, reset the MCP to the new altitude. Next, push the altitude selector. Notice the 10,000-foot restriction at Fillmore was deleted. Now push the altitude selector 2 more times to delete the altitude restrictions at Hassa and Denay. Each push of the altitude selector deletes an altitude restriction between the airplane and the MCP altitude. On some Boeing airplanes, the FMC makes idle thrust descents to waypoint altitude constraints. If an altitude constraint is reached before the waypoint, the airplane levels off. On the 747, the airplane flies a direct path to the next constraint. The autothrottle engages in speed and increases thrust to maintain the descent speed. You are level at 4,000 feet and ATC clears you to 3,400 feet. Make the descent in vertical speed at 500 feet per minute. With vertical speed engaged, the selected vertical speed shows on the display. We're now on an intercept heading to the localizer, and ATC just cleared us for the ILS approach. Arm approach. Localizer and glide slope enunciate on the FMA. All three autopilots are armed for engagement below 1,500 feet radio altitude on localizer and glide slope. In this airplane, the FMC automatically sets the frequency and front course for the selected ILS approach. The localizer captures if the track is within 120 degrees of the localizer course. On localizer capture, the ILS front course automatically sets in the MCP heading window. With localizer captured, but prior to glide slope capture, the approach mode can be disengaged by pushing a toga switch or by selecting another roll mode other than LNAV. Once the glide slope is captured, you can set the missed approach altitude to 5,000 feet. Once both the localizer and glide slope are captured, the approach mode can only be disengaged by pushing a toga switch or disengaging the autopilot and turning off both flight directors. At 1,500 feet radio altitude, the Autoflight system goes through a pre-autoland test. After satisfactorily completing the test, Land 3 enunciates, indicating all three autopilots are engaged and operating normally for an automatic landing. Rollout and flare also arm at this point. If a crosswind is present, runway alignment occurs between 500 feet and 200 feet radio altitude. Runway alignment is when the airplane changes from a crab to a slip. There is no enunciation when the airplane aligns with the runway. Between 60 and 40 feet radio altitude, flare engages. At 25 feet radio altitude, the autothrottle begins retarding the thrust to idle. About 5 feet RA, rollout engages, and the autopilot controls the rudder and the nose wheel steering to keep the airplane on localizer centerline. Selecting reverse thrust disconnects the autothrottle. When disconnected this way, the ICAS message does not display and the caution light does not illuminate. Finally, before turning off the runway, disconnect the autopilot with the disconnect switch on the control wheel and cancel the warning with a second push. Now, let's go back to the approach phase of our flight and look at a go-around. Go around arms when glide slope captures or the flaps are extended. There is no enunciation when go around arms. Push either toga switch to initiate the go around. The auto throttle engages in thrust mode. Thrust is set for a 2,000 feet per minute climb. If full go-around thrust is required, simply push either toga switch a second time. When go-around is initiated, the flight directors appear even if the flight director switches are off. Toga enunciates for roll and for pitch. The autopilot controls roll to maintain current track. Pitch controls either the MCP speed or the speed at go-around initiation, whichever is greater. If the airplane exceeds either of these speeds for more than 5 seconds, the current speed becomes the target speed. When above 400 feet, roll and pitch modes are available. Engage LNAV. If the approach mode was Land 2 or Land 3, multiple autopilots remain engaged during the go-around until a roll or pitch mode other than toga is engaged. Autopilot rudder compensation for any asymmetric thrust condition discontinues upon reversion to a single autopilot. The rudder returns to the trimmed position unless the pilot exerts the rudder pedal force required to maintain the rudder pressure. Above 1,000 feet radio altitude, VNAV or flight level change is selected for acceleration and flap retraction. Engage VNAV. During your go-around, the glide slope went down. ATC now has you on radar vectors for the localizer-only approach. You have just been cleared for the approach, so arm the localizer mode. The MDA for this approach is 460 feet. Set the next lower altitude, 400 feet, in the altitude window. At the descent point, select vertical speed. Set the desired vertical speed. Plan to stop your descent at the 460-foot MDA using altitude hold. You recall from the last approach that the glide slope angle was a normal 3 degrees. You can monitor the airplane's descent angle with a flight path vector. Display the flight path vector. The flight path vector is displayed on the PFD. The runway is in sight, and you are cleared to land. Nice approach. This completes the instruction section of this lesson.